Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on, because every week we bring forgotten stories of World War II back to life. Tales of courage, mystery, and machines that seemed to have a soul. And in today's story, one of the strangest flights of the entire war. A B-17 bomber that returned home across the Channel, with every man aboard unconscious. This is the story of the bomber that landed itself. April the 12th, 1944. 28,000 feet above the churned grey of the English Channel, heading east toward home. You are in the nose turret, pressed against the cold plexiglass as wind sings across riveted seams. The sky outside is a flat steel sheet, the sun a pale coin. Inside the B-17G nicknamed Zombie, the world is smaller, a lattice of cables, oxygen hoses, and stitched leather. The bomber smells of oil and warmed metal, aftershave clinging to uniforms, and the faint, ever-present tang of aviation gasoline. Sergeant Pete Malone, waist gunner, breathes shallow through his mask. His hands are steady on the twin 50s because he has to be. Beside him, the fuselage hums with the thrum of 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, a heartbeat the crew has trusted across 3 combat tours. At the waist bulkhead, the intercom clicks with the tinny voice of Lieutenant Samuel Sam Hargrove, the radio operator, reading the latest frequency change from 91st Bomb Group. His chewing gum snaps in the silence between sentences. Up front, First Lieutenant Tommy Reed, pilot, keeps the fortress level by hand, while the bombardier, a young corporal named Eddie Fisk, studies the drift and calls out corrections. They have a simple goal this morning. Cross the Channel, drop their spare parts crate over a repair field in Kent, and be back at Bassingbourn for tea and a debrief. At 28,000 feet, the world is unforgiving. Oxygen is not optional. The crew's survival depends on the thin, hard plastic masks clipped to the oxygen outlets, the green hoses that snake across the passageways like lifelines. The B-17 is not pressurized. None of them are. So every man moves with a steady habit of checking his gauge, tightening his tube, reminding the man beside him to pull the mask snug. The fortress itself is a cathedral of circuitry and raw steel, the fuselage a living organism that answers to throttle, trim, and 1,000 small human adjustments. Then, without warning, a small jolt, a snapping sound like a thick rope tearing. The intercom dies. Pete's fingers tighten on the turret rail. He glances aft. The ball turret is empty this morning. PFC Jenkins is on sick call. He calls for Tommy through the throat mic. Static. No answer. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Reed frowns and toggles the intercom switch. Nothing. He drums his knuckles along the metal panel and gets only the aircraft's mechanical mutter in reply. The first seconds are always full of false starts, a loose wire, a bad relay. But there's more. The needle's on, the oxygen regulators dip, and the hiss that should accompany a constant flow of life is thinner now. Starved. Lieutenant Hargrove looks at his gauge. The needle skates toward empty as if drawn by an invisible hand. He pats his mask and finds the hose slack where it should be taut. He turns to the cockpit to shout. And the sound dies in his throat because the rest of the plane is falling away from him, figuratively. By the time the men realize oxygen is failing, it does not fail dramatically. It steals them away in a soft, traitorous way. Hypoxia is a thief who comes with a smile. Vision narrows, thoughts become syrupy, slow. Speech slurs into a gentle, incomprehensible lullaby. A man thinks he is tired, then that he can sleep for 5 minutes, then 10. The fortress continues to fly because metal remembers what hands taught it. Someone left the autopilot on. Someone, it seems, trusted the Sperry gyro stabilizer to hold the machine true. Lieutenant Reed's last clear memory is of reaching for the trim wheel to correct a subtle port roll. He remembers the leather of the wheel in his palm, the fine grit of a cigarette ash lodged in the cup holder, the scent of engine oil. Then a calm, like a blanket, settles over perception. He loosens his grip. In the back of the plane, Corporal Fisk smiles for no reason at all and rests his cheek against the cold metal of the bomb site housing. Minutes pass. The autopilot, the invisible hand, continues to do what it was designed to do. Keep the fortress set on its heading, maintain attitude, keep a wing leveled. The propellers still bite the thin air. The rights pull. But there is a quiet at the heart of the aircraft that sounds like a dry throat. Gauges creep. The mixture controls move with a thoughtless economy. Engines begin to cough on the thin upper air. At high altitude, they already hawk small globs of oil. The four R-1820s, each a symphony of pistons and valves, start to lose their pitch. Down in the navigator's table, Ensign Harold Harry Cooper, young, with a pencil always tucked behind his ear, had, minutes earlier, been laying out a course with meticulous crosses and a practiced thumb tracing. Now his head lolls against his chest, and the pencil slips from damp fingers onto a chart rucked with plotted threads. The sextant weeps condensation. His last conscious action is to lay a hand across the radio log, as if to anchor a life to paper. Outside, the channel stretches, and below that, the cliffs of the English coast show a ragged white along the horizon, closer than they should be given their heading. In the automatic world of the fortress, the autopilot begins to make minor corrections for the changing aerodynamic load as the engines start to lose power. The aircraft begins a subtle, almost imperceptible descent. Instruments show what the men do not have the clarity to read. A gradual bleed in manifold pressure, a creeping drop in RPM. Fuel flow fluctuates as regulators gasp in the parquetry, thinning air. Back at the waist, Sergeant Malone's eyes slide closed. He fights to keep them open, blinking until the lids feel like weights. He tries to yell, to call someone. There is a sound in his throat, but when he forces breath out, it is shallow and frosted on the inside of the mask. The mask itself has started to fog. The oxygen line runs slack across his knees. Panic arranges itself in the brain, but panic requires speed and coherence to seize control. Hypoxia will not give them that luxury. They slip into a shared, dreamlike drift. Not death, not yet, but the uncomfortable middle ground that the men of bomber crews learn to fear more than bullets. The fortress keeps flying. There are small mechanical signs of the catastrophe that no man alive notes. The vacuum pump begins to cough. The gyro horizon hums a fraction off. The hydraulic pressure for the flaps eases like blood from a slow cut. The autopilot compensates for the very small changes, tightening its servos here, trimming a degree there. In the navigator's small realm, the drift table under the chart is still brushed with pencil marks that make a map of intention and habit. The pencil mark that should indicate the correction for a northerly crosswind is incomplete. A stub left mid-stroke as the hand relaxed for the last time. At 27,500 feet, the temperature outside is near 40 degrees Celsius. Ice cakes the leading edges of the airframe and studs the pits around the guns. The fortress, loaded with its sagging weight, begins to descend with a patient, inexorable grace. Below the cloud deck there is a smaller world, a quilt of plowed fields and hedgerows dotted with hedgerow trees and the neat rectangles of airfields. It is late morning where those neat rectangles lie, and tea kettles will be singing in farmhouses that afternoon. Nobody on the ground yet knows of the droning metal shadow that will find them. Inside Zombie, the men sleep as if drugged, not by morphine, but by the thinness of the air and a system that failed at its most vital moment. In the cockpit, the altimeter unwinds like a second hand, each click a heartbeat slipping away. The fortress, for all its human cargo, has become its own steward. It follows the last commands given by muscle memory and mechanical instinct, while its crew dreams through the thin oxygen like drowned men breathing through a cracked mask. Far ahead and below, a solitary tower set at an auxiliary field in Kent catches sight of the descending prop wash. A farmer notices first the shadow that moves like an island across his field. He squints up and thinks for a moment of ordnance and warning. But the plane is not in a steep dive, not erratic. It sails, a monstrous gull with folded wings. No tracer rounds cut the sky, no fighters pursue. Only the fortress, all metal and will, drifting toward the English coast with its living cargo asleep inside. And then, from a distance, a whisper of a sound that could be throttle and could be prayer. One engine surges, then stumbles. A second drops like a tired man. The fortress shudders as the balance of power beneath its wings changes. Trim tabs twitch as if to correct for a phantom gust. The autopilot struggles to compensate for decreasing thrust. The aircraft begins its slow, composure-less descent toward a countryside that will soon need to choose whether to be a runway, cemetery, or miracle. The first thing the airfield observers at RAF Seething noticed that morning was the sound. Not the usual incoming drone of returning squadrons, but a single uneven hum that drifted through the cloud deck like a heartbeat faltering in the distance. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Pritchard stepped out from the control hut, shielding his eyes against the grey sun. The sky was a heavy ceiling, patched with ragged clouds rolling inland from the channel. Somewhere above that murk, an engine coughed. Once, twice, then settled into an irregular rhythm. "Fortress," one of the ground crew muttered. "Looks like she's coming in dead stick." Pritchard frowned. The B-17 was an unmistakable silhouette. The high tail fin, the broad shoulders of her wings, the glass nose gleaming even in weak daylight. But something was wrong. The bomber drifted, not flew. She came in on a shallow, deliberate glide, one propeller windmilling freely while another shuddered in half-turns, sputtering grey exhaust. He reached for his binoculars and focused. The aircraft's nose bore a crude emblem, a zombie-like figure with outstretched arms, the word zombie stenciled beneath in flaking white paint. "Radio her," Pritchard ordered. "Call sign, markings, whatever she's got." The radio operator tried, his voice steady through the static. "Unidentified fortress approaching from the southeast. This is RAF Seething control. Do you copy?" "Over." Only silence answered. "Try again." Still nothing. The air was filled only with the dull roar of 4 uneven engines and the gentle whistle of the wind. By now, a dozen men stood outside, staring upward as the bomber came through a ragged break in the clouds. Her flaps were down, but far too early and too shallow. The landing lights were off. Her bomb bay doors hung half open like slack jaws. "She's not trimmed for approach," Pritchard muttered. "Where's her pilot?" The B-17 wobbled slightly, corrected, then leveled again, all on her own. She seemed to be holding a heading straight for the grass strip, as if she knew where home was. Inside the cockpit, no one moved. Lieutenant Reed sat slumped against the yoke, oxygen mask fogged and eyes closed beneath his goggles. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Charlie Maynard, lay half-reclined in his seat, hands still resting on the throttle levers. Both men were pale, motionless, their harnesses keeping them upright as the fortress rode the last of her altitude. The altimeter ticked past 4,000 feet. The gyro drifted lazily. The autopilot servos whined as they tried to maintain level flight, with 2 engines coughing their last. Down in the waist, Sergeant Malone's head lolled against the frame of the 50 cal turret. The wind through the open gun ports fluttered the edges of his flight jacket. The oxygen hoses still trailed across the deck, stiff with frost. And yet, impossibly, the aircraft held her glide slope. The men on the ground began waving colored signal panels, more from habit than expectation. Pritchard watched the fortress pass low over the perimeter fence, her wingtips steady, her flaps half down, wheels beginning to lower with a hesitant mechanical grind. One of the undercarriage doors jammed halfway, but the right wheel locked into place with a hollow thunk. "She's lowering gear," a mechanic shouted. Pritchard's mind ran through the possibilities. Had the crew bailed out? Were they all gone, leaving the autopilot to fly the rest of the way? But no. He could see them now, faintly, shadows through the glass. Forms sitting exactly where they should be. Dead. Unconscious? The Fortress crossed the treetops, no more than 50 feet up now. The left inboard engine gave one last convulsive sputter and seized, throwing a brief tongue of flame. The plane yawed, nose dipping dangerously, then, as if corrected by invisible hands, steadied again. The remaining engines kept their fragile rhythm, just enough to keep her aloft. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered. "She's flying herself." The landing gear kissed the grass first with the right wheel, bouncing, then the left. The bomber slewed sideways, the rudder twitching in dead spasms as the control surfaces moved under hydraulic pressure alone. The nose wheel came down hard, digging a furrow into the soft spring earth. The aircraft rolled, engines gasping, propellers biting unevenly. One finally quit with a cough that trailed into silence. Then another. The Fortress coasted, slower, slower, until the final engine stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the ticking of cooling metal and the faint hiss of wind through the fuselage holes. Pritchard and his men stood motionless, as if afraid to break the spell. The B-17 had landed herself, all the way down, gear locked, flaps set, trim perfect enough to save her crew from a fiery end. "Get the medics!" Pritchard barked at last, voice hoarse. "Move, now!" A dozen men sprinted across the field toward the motionless bomber. As they approached, they saw the frost-rimed windows, the frozen oxygen lines, the ghostly stillness inside. The side hatch refused to budge at first. The pressure had frozen the latch tight, until a crowbar forced it open with a scream of metal. The first man to climb inside swore he'd stepped into a tomb. Every surface glittered with ice crystals. Every figure sat like sculpture, eyes closed, skin bluish in the thin light filtering through the clouds. And yet, miraculously, they were still alive. Weak pulses, faint breaths, shallow but steady. The medics worked fast, dragging the crew out one by one, laying them on stretchers across the grass. Oxygen bottles hissed as masks were pressed to pale faces. Slowly, one by one, eyelids fluttered. Lieutenant Reed stirred first. His lips moved without sound. Then he whispered, voice faint as wind. "Are we home?" The medic nodded, eyes wide. "Aye, lad. You made it home?" Reed blinked, frowning. "Did we land?" "You did, sir," said Pritchard quietly, kneeling beside him. "Though I can't say how." Behind them, the great machine sat motionless, tilted slightly on one flat tire, her propellers frozen mid-turn. The painted name beneath the cockpit, Zombie, gleamed faintly in the pale afternoon sun. It was a fitting name, thought Pritchard. A plane that should have died over the channel, but refused to stay down, the Fortress that wouldn't die. By the time dusk fell over RAF Seething, the B-17 Zombie was cordoned off with flood lamps and ropes. Military police kept watch while technicians and flight engineers crawled across her hull, flashlights glinting off aluminum skin pocked with ice and grime. The medics had carried all 10 crewmen to the infirmary, barely conscious, oxygen-starved but alive. Word spread fast through the base. A plane that landed itself. Pilots, mechanics, and ground crew whispered about it over mugs of coffee in the mess, each adding a detail more unbelievable than the last. Some swore the bomber had flared perfectly on final approach, that her throttles had moved on their own. Others insisted the landing gear came down at just the right moment, as if an unseen pilot guided her by hand. The real explanation, however, was more complicated and no less mysterious. Squadron Maintenance Officer Captain Raymond Kearns oversaw the inspection personally. He was a broad-shouldered man with grease-stained sleeves and a permanent squint from years of peering into sunlight off propellers. Kneeling beneath the nose, he ran his gloved hand along the gear struts, feeling for damage. The tires were half flat from the soft ground, but the landing had been remarkably clean. "She came down like a bird," he muttered. "If they'd hit 2 feet to port, she'd have cartwheeled." At his side, Sergeant Lyle Dugan, one of the crew chiefs, shone a light through the cockpit window. "No sign of anybody at the controls, sir. Oxygen lines are all frozen. Looks like they blacked out before crossing the coast." Kearns nodded. "Then what in God's name kept her flying?" They found the answer, or part of it, in the pilot's chair. The control yoke was still clutched by Lieutenant Reed's right hand, frozen stiff from the cold. The trim tab levers were locked almost dead center, perfectly balanced. The autopilot, a Sperry A3 gyro unit, was still switched on. The servos hummed faintly when powered, a quiet, insect-like vibration that told them it had been engaged the entire flight. "She must have leveled herself," Dugan said softly. "Autopilot held her steady. Maybe wind pushed her west." Kearns scratched his chin. "Aye, but autopilot doesn't land a plane, doesn't drop flaps or gear either." They found more clues in the throttle quadrant. The friction locks were tightened, enough to hold the engines at a steady cruising setting even after the pilots lost consciousness. Over time, as fuel pressure fell and mixtures leaned out, each engine would have begun to cough and die in sequence. Yet the Fortress stayed trimmed, even as she lost power. Kearns leaned back against the fuselage, staring at the silent machine. "She came home on muscle memory," he said. 1,000 small adjustments her pilots drilled into her over 100 flights. Maybe she just remembered. It wasn't poetic nonsense. Pilots often said the B-17 flew like a living thing. She could hold a line with a wounded wing, bring crews home missing engines, even respond to touch through a broken yoke. But what Zombie had done defied every expectation of mechanical instinct. That night, as the ground crews secured her under tarpaulin, a cold mist rolled in off the fields. The bomber loomed in the floodlight glare, a silver ghost, her name painted like a prophecy on the nose. Her wings sagged with dew. One propeller, frozen mid-turn, caught the lamplight and gleamed as if alive. The following morning, the investigation began in earnest. Major Henry Caldwell, representing the 8th Air Force's technical section, arrived from Bassingbourn with a small convoy of trucks. He was not an easily impressed man, but as soon as he stepped onto the field and saw Zombie, his stride slowed. "She's intact?" he asked. "Mostly," said Kearns. "Port inboard engine seized. Number 3 coughed itself out on final. But the airframe's sound." Caldwell climbed the ladder into the cockpit. The smell of oil and frozen sweat still clung to the interior. Frost crystals glittered across the dials, 1,000 tiny mirrors catching morning light. "Looks like she came down gentle," Caldwell murmured. "Hell of a thing." He flipped through the pilot's log still clipped to the panel. The last entry, written in pencil in Reed's firm, square handwriting, read simply, "Altitude 28,000, course 310, returning home." Below that, a faint smudge where the pencil trailed off mid-word. "Hypoxia," Caldwell said after a moment. "System failure." "Must have been the oxygen regulator manifold," Kearns replied. "We checked. It froze solid at altitude. No flow to any station." "So they all went out together," Caldwell concluded. "And she just kept going." He sat in the pilot's seat, resting one hand on the yoke. For a moment he tried to imagine it. The sudden quiet when voices on the intercom stopped. The frost creeping up the inside of the glass. The weightless feeling as awareness slipped away. Then the ghostly persistence of the machine continued to fly. No panic, no fear, just the perfect obedience of engineering. Later that afternoon, the crew of Zombie regained full consciousness in the base infirmary. Their lungs ached from cold burns, their eyes bloodshot, but all 10 men would survive. Lieutenant Reed was the first to ask what had happened. "Where's my ship?" he rasped. Pritchard, standing beside his bed, smiled faintly. "Outside, waiting for you. She landed herself." Reed blinked, disbelieving. "Landed itself?" "That's right. You were all out cold. Autopilot brought her in. Wheels down, flaps half set, perfect glide path." The pilot stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then quietly, "I trimmed her before we lost pressure. Just a touch of nose up, heading home. Didn't think it'd matter." "It mattered," said Pritchard. "Might have saved every man aboard." Word of the incident soon spread beyond the base, first to the 8th Air Force Command at High Wycombe, then to newspapers back home in the States. The press called it the plane that flew without pilots. Airmen called it something simpler, a miracle. But for the men who'd lived it, the story felt different. They spoke of the deep cold, the fading light, the strange peace that came before the blackness. And they remembered the sound, faint, constant, reassuring, of the engines still turning long after their minds had slipped away. When Lieutenant Reed was well enough to walk again, he visited the bomber. Standing under her nose, he ran a hand over the chipped paint of her name, Zombie. He smiled faintly. "You always did have a mind of your own," he said. And as the morning wind moved across the field, it was easy to believe just for a moment that the fortress heard him. For weeks after the incident, Zombie remained parked at the edge of RAF Seething, part aircraft, part legend. Pilots from nearby bases drove miles just to see the B-17 that had, as the story went, flown itself home. To the mechanics, she was a technical marvel. To the airmen, she was something closer to holy. Some men left small tokens beneath her nose art. A lucky charm, a piece of flak-shredded metal, even a photograph of a sweetheart. Others swore that during night patrols, when the wind moved through her empty fuselage, they could still hear the low hum of engines that no longer turned. The Army Air Forces issued a formal report. It was clinical, impersonal. The sort of language designed to make sense of the impossible. Aircraft B-17 G45BO, serial 4297278, nickname Zombie. Incident date, 12th April 1944. Crew incapacitated due to failure of oxygen regulation manifold at approximately 28,000 feet. Autopilot maintained controlled descent. Aircraft landed at RAF Seething, England, with minor structural damage. All the crew recovered. The report concluded with one final line. The event demonstrates the durability and design integrity of Boeing Model 2989 series aircraft. But that neat sentence didn't capture the strangeness of it. The eerie grace of an empty bomber gliding through cloud and cold, guided by nothing but trim, wind, and chance. In the days following, Lieutenant Reed and his crew visited the aircraft together for the first time since their rescue. They stood in silence, scattered around her like mourners around a grave. The ground still bore the faint furrow from her landing, a scar of turned earth that led to her resting place. The grass had already begun to grow over it. Sergeant Pete Malone, his face still pale from the ordeal, ran a hand over one of the waist guns. "You ever think she didn't want to go down out there?" he asked. Reed smiled weakly. "She's stubborn, always was." They climbed back inside. The interior smelled faintly of oil and frost, and of something else, like cold air sealed too long. The instruments were frozen mid-story. Altimeter at 600 feet, manifold pressure sagged low, the magnetic compass steady on 310. Their last heading home. On the navigator's table lay Cooper's chart, edges curled from damp. The pencil still lay where he dropped it. A faint line traced their route from over France, across the Channel, straight toward Seething. Almost perfect. "How'd she find her way?" Cooper asked softly. "We didn't mark that heading." "She didn't need to," Reed said. guess she remembered where she belonged. After the war, Zombie was returned to the States with a handful of other veteran bombers for inspection and training. By then, the Air Force had more aircraft than it knew what to do with. She was stripped, refitted, and flown briefly as a test platform out of Wright Field, Ohio. Then, like so many others, she was retired to a scrapyard near Kingman, Arizona. When the cutter's torches finally bit into her wings, no one there knew her story. Not the fogged oxygen masks, not the silent flight, not the ghostly landing. She was just another worn-out machine in a desert of forgotten metal. But her legend lived on among the men who had seen her glide out of the clouds that day. Stories passed from one generation of airmen to the next. The kind of story told late at night, when the wind rattles the hangar doors and the runway lights blink like distant stars. They said there was something in those old fortresses, a spirit forged from all the hands that had built them, flown them, patched them back together after flak and fire. Maybe that was why some of them seemed to know the way home, even when their crews couldn't. In 1967, a retired pilot named Charles Maynard, once the co-pilot of Zombie, was interviewed for a documentary about the air war. When asked about that April morning, he smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "She didn't land herself," he said. "We just set her up right. We gave her a fighting chance. The rest, well, that was up to her." The interviewer asked if he believed the plane had somehow wanted to come home. Maynard looked down, thoughtful. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But I think it's simpler than that. She was built by people who knew what home meant, and maybe that's what she was flying toward." Today, the story of Zombie survives mostly in faded reports, footnotes, and the recollections of aging veterans. Her name occasionally surfaces in aviation forums and archival exhibits about the 8th Air Force, a ghost among ghosts. But to those who've studied the black and white photos, the fortress resting in the mist at Seething, her props still, her nose tilted slightly upward as if in quiet defiance, there's an undeniable feeling that lingers. It's the same feeling every airman knows before takeoff, the hush before the engines start, the brief moment when the aircraft seems to hold its breath, waiting for life to return. Because Zombie wasn't just a machine. She was proof that sometimes, even in the cold emptiness of war, something built by human hands can find its own way home.